Hey everybody, this is a lecture to make up for the class that we missed during Hurricane Florence. I hope everybody has been safe while we've been out of class. So, to pick up where we left off last Thursday, we were talking then about The Spectator. We didn't get a chance to talk about Swift's modest proposal, but the two are very strongly connected. As I tried to suggest, The Spectator, published in 1711-12, was an important part of a new public sphere in which citizens discussed the manners, morals, ideas, and politics of their nation in print. This, as Habermas and others have argued, was crucial for the development of middle-class democracy. As people began to see themselves as meaningful actors in what was becoming known as public life, they developed ways of writing and thinking through which public life would be conducted. Addison's writing style and the persona of Mr. Spectator both modeled the tone of orderly and polite, rational debate. Jonathan Swift, who lived from 1667 to 1745, took an active part in such public debates, writing about literature, politics, and religion. He was an Anglican clergyman in equal measure. The question of who gets to participate in the life of a nation may have been particularly visible to him as an Anglican clergyman, ethnically English and born of English parents, who lived most of his life in Ireland, a country with a Roman Catholic majority. A Modest Proposal, then, is a satire on precisely the kinds of public rational debates that Addison and Steele modeled and Habermas later celebrated. His projector says, "I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children, in the arms or on the backs or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance. And therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound and useful members of the Commonwealth would deserve so well of the public as to have a statue set up for a preserver of the nation." Note how the imaginary writer of this imaginary opinion piece, critics usually refer to him, as he refers to himself, as the projector, appeals to consensus and agreement. He is rehearsing the moves by which citizens claim to speak to the public and direct the future of the nation. His case must therefore be utterly rational. Note the way he appeals to economic statistics, the most valued commodity of the mercantile capitalist classes that Addison celebrates in the character of Sir Andrew Freeport. "I have already computed the charge of nursing a beggar's child, in which list I reckon all cottagers, laborers, and 4/5 of the farmers, to be about 2 shillings per annum, rags included. And I believe no gentleman would repine to give 10 shillings for the carcass of a good fat child, which, as I have said, will make 4 dishes of excellent nutritive meat, when he hath only some particular friend or his own family to dine with him. Thus the squire will learn to be a good landlord and grow popular among his tenants. The mother will have 8 shillings neat profit, and be fit for work till she produceth another child." A rational economy, data-driven, we might say today, is the key to national prosperity, and the criterion by which all proposals for public action must be judged. And yet there's clearly something wrong here. The projector seems oblivious to the moral consequences of his economic plans. Swift pushes his character's obliviousness to the point of absurdity. At least he depends upon his reader's shared belief that human beings should under no circumstances ever be eaten by other human beings. This might seem like an obvious satirical enlargement. Nobody would eat babies, right? And yet it's important to realize that the British colonial economy was, at the time Swift was writing, actively being built on the dehumanization of workers. First and foremost, the Africans, who were kidnapped and sold in a manner not so different from what the projector here proposes for the Irish. who, as England's first colonized people, were largely excluded from the public sphere that controlled their country. Swift asks us to question whether the rational world of reasoned debate and capitalist exchange might, in fact, be morally bankrupt. Of course, Swift also participates in the public sphere, even as he satirizes it. And toward the end of the essay, his projector makes a number of suggestions that the reader is invited to see as genuinely reasonable and moral. The projector says that nobody is really willing to do any of these things. But it's worth noting that these suggestions depend on a notion of patriotism, the belief that everyone living in a nation counts and matters. Swift hopes that the Anglo-Irish might consider Ireland their country, and therefore see the Irish as equal members of their society. But it's hardly clear to Swift that this could actually happen. He's quite skeptical of the claims of progressive political thinkers who ignore the realities of power. What do you think? Swift's satirical stance in A Modest Proposal was not out of character. For more than a decade, Swift had been part of a club of Tory writers who published satirical works using the figure of Martina Scriblerus, a fictional scholar whose stupidity represented everything the Tories, loosely conservatives, although not at all in the way that term is used today in the US, thought was wrong with the literary world of London. Among its members was the young poetic prodigy Alexander Pope. Pope's major success was his essay on criticism, which he published when he was just 23 years old in 1711. In the essay, Pope attempts not just to define what good poetry should be, but to make good poetry himself. In this passage, for instance, he makes fun of unimaginative poets who repeat the same tired rhymes over and over again. While they ring round the same unvaried chimes with sure returns of still expected rhymes, where'er you find the cooling western breeze, in the next line it whispers through the trees. If crystal streams with pleasing murmurs creep, the reader's threatened, not in vain, with sleep. Notice that instead of simply repeating the rhyme of creep with sleep, he makes an ironic play on sleep, speaking both of the word itself and of the concept it signifies. Pope's poem shows us his ideal of what an intelligent, sensitive, and responsible reader should be, and by extension, what he thinks an intelligent, sensitive, and responsible person should be. But where's the man who counsel can bestow, still pleased to teach, and yet not proud to know? Unbiased or by favor or by spite, not duly prepossessed nor blindly right, though learned, well-bred, and though well-bred, sincere, modestly bold and humanly severe, who to a friend his faults can freely show, and gladly praise the merit of a foe, blessed with a taste exact yet unconfined, a knowledge both of books and humankind, generous converse, a soul exempt from pride, and love to praise with reason on his side. Note that Pope's philosophy of literature and life is embodied in the way he writes. In nearly every line, he balances one concept against another and encourages us to avoid extremes. For Pope, a virtuous person is always both one thing and another. Notice all the both and, or either or, not one thing nor another in this passage. Note, too, how Pope embodies that ideal in the form of his lines. Each line is split with a pause in the middle, separating the two concepts being compared. This was an astounding performance for a 23-year-old, but Pope had been ambitious all his life. Even in this portrait, at the age of 7, Pope is depicted holding the laurel branch, symbolizing poetic achievement. Pope carefully crafted a public image of himself as the man destined to be England's greatest poet. Indeed, in this portrait, he is crowned with the laurel wreath of the poet laureate, a Roman position that had been revived in the Restoration by the first English poet laureate, John Dryden. The laureate was appointed to create official poems meant to embody the ideals of the nation and its language. That tradition continues to this day, though the poet laureate is no longer expected to produce poems strictly in the service of the state. The current UK poet laureate is Carol Ann Duffy, known for her feminist ideals and anti-establishment politics. The US appoints a laureate as well. Her job is to promote poetry throughout the country. I strongly recommend the current laureate, Tracy K. Smith. Her poems are accessible, touching, and fun. But Alexander Pope would never be poet laureate. First of all, he was Roman Catholic, which meant that he was prohibited from holding any government office. Catholics were also prohibited from attending the universities and, of course, from voting. In this way, Pope was an outsider, constantly fighting for a place at the center of a culture that did not accept him. He was also an outsider in another way. He was physically disabled. As a child, he was afflicted with Pott's disease, or tuberculosis of the spine, which left him with a humped back, asthma, and generally poor health. He was also quite tiny, never exceeding 4.5 feet tall. Here's an unsympathetic sketch of him by a contemporary. Nonetheless, Pope cultivated a public image as a stylish ladies' man, and in everything he did, including, first and foremost, his poetry, you see a person dedicated to sophistication and style. This brings us to The Rape of the Lock. As poetry, it may seem unfamiliar in many ways. First of all, it is very public poetry on a social subject. In the early 18th century, people didn't just write poems to express their subjective feelings. Poetry was a way to make beauty out of any aspect of life. Secondly, it concerns a very specific social situation. Arabella Farmer was an eligible young woman from a prominent Catholic gentry family. Another rich young Catholic, Lord Peter, had cut off a lock of her hair at a social event. Miss Farmer was not amused and abused Lord Peter to her social circle. This was bad for her family, who would benefit from a match with a socially prominent young man, and also for the Catholic gentry as a group, who were a disliked minority with a public relations problem to begin with. Pope took this bit of gossip and made something fantastical out of it, hoping that everyone would then find the situation amusing instead of mortifying, and, most importantly, that everyone would think he himself was clever. To do so, he did something that is probably even more unfamiliar to you. He composed his poem in satirical imitation of a classical epic. Here's how it begins. What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I sing. This verse to Carol, muse, is due. This even Belinda may vouchsafe to view. Slight is the subject, but not so the praise, if she inspire, and he approve my lays. Epic was something Pope knew well. Indeed, in 1713, year after he first wrote his first version of The Rape of the Lock, he would make his own fortune by publishing an English translation of Homer's Iliad. Pope's Homer sold so well that he was able to live thereafter as an independent gentleman. Recall that it was only since 1705 that English authors had been able to claim copyright to their works. Pope sold his book by subscription, asking people to pay in advance to finance the publication costs. A business model that disappeared during the 19th and 20th centuries, but has returned in the form of crowdsourcing. Hey look, Joseph Addison is on the list. Like all epics, Homer's Iliad begins by invoking the muse to sing through the poet. Here's how it begins. Achilles' wrath, to grease the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, and such the will of Jove. Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife, from what offended power Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. The king of men his reverent priest defied, and for the king's offense the people died. That is a grand beginning for a grand poem. The Rape of the Lock, on the other hand, begins with irony. The dire offense here is by no means dire, or so we are supposed to believe anyway. More about that in a moment. From the start, it is a poem about making grand gestures over trivial things. And it is itself, by using a grand epic style to talk about a small domestic drama, a grand gesture over a trivial thing. Pope's irony is delicate and delicious. His craftsmanship is nearly always impeccable. Here, for instance, we are to understand that the secret truths are not so secret. Really, he's just exhorting Arabella to use some common sense, by which he means, stop being such a baby about a guy cutting off your hair, and stop being so vain about your appearance. Note how he links maids alone to children, ironically telling Arabella to stop acting like a child. Note, too, the classic Pope rhyme of concealed and revealed. The terms are opposite in meaning, and yoked together they emphasize the idea that Arabella should wise up to what everybody else can see about her situation. That is, that it's not really such a big deal. Another great rhyme here. No farther yet, whoever fair and chaste rejects mankind is by some sylph embraced. Here, through the rhyme of chaste and embraced, Pope asks us to think about the relationship of chastity to the embrace of the sylphs, that is, virtuous moral behavior, which should guide young women. Pope is making fun of young women's pride in their appearance, but he also likes them. Or does he? Pope's poem is at its most delightful when it's paying close attention to the beautiful surfaces of life. Here, Belinda's hair and makeup routine. Note how worldwide trade makes its way into even this most private of spaces. The inferior priestess at her altar's side, trembling, begins the sacred rites of pride. Unnumbered treasures ope at once, and here the various offerings of the world appear. From each she nicely culls with curious toil, and decks the goddess with the glittering spoil. This casket India's glowing gems unlocks, and all Arabia breathes from yonder box. Here files of pins extend their shining rows, puffs, powders, patches, Bibles, billet doux. Note 2, Pope's masterful deployment of sounds, the repetitions of vowels and consonants, assonance and alliteration that tie words together. So, when Pope is talking about Belinda's hair as the destruction of mankind, he brings a certain irony to the idea that women can control, slay, if you will, men with their beauty, implying that Lord Peter is not to be blamed for snipping Arabella's hair. He couldn't help it, and besides, it just means that he likes her. This nymph, to the destruction of mankind, nourished 2 locks which graceful hung behind in equal curls, and well conspired to deck with shining ringlets the smooth ivory neck. But I think it's really important that we think about this further. After all, even though the rape in the poem's title is used ironically and in a mostly non-sexual sense, meaning a forcible abduction, what we're talking about here is a situation where a man violates a woman's personal space because he can, and when the woman complains about it, the male poet tells her to stop complaining and be a good sport. Remember, too, that Pope is always concerned with his own public image as a poet. At the poem's end, he imagines the story of Belinda's hair as an occasion for poetic immortality, certainly for Arabella Farmer, but much more relevantly for Alexander Pope. But trust the muse, she saw it upward rise, though marked by none but quick poetic eyes. This lock the muse shall consecrate to fame, and midst the stars inscribe Belinda's name. Pope's poetic achievement is undeniable. I encourage you to go back and read it again sometime. The descriptions of the card game and the coffee party in Canto 3 are particularly clever and delightful. At the same time, though, there's something undeniably demeaning about this poem's treatment of the young woman at its center, something we in 2018 are perhaps more likely to recognize and discuss publicly. So I ask you, should we be reading The Rape of the Lock today? Let's discuss this in class.